Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, January 20th, 2021, and in just about an hour, President-elect Joe Biden will be sworn in, and there will be a new incoming administration under President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. Now, this is my final video under the Trump administration. It's currently 10:42 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, so this is something that's probably going to be released around 11:30. And today we're just going to be discussing the Trump legacy and how Donald Trump leaves office, being one of the most disapproved of presidents in United States history. On top of that, he has the highest disapproval rating of any president that has ever been polled during their outgoing time period. That's literally every president dating back to President Harry Truman. So we're talking about over half a century of polling data, and Donald Trump still remains the most unpopular president out of all of them, including Richard Nixon, someone who had to resign as a result of things that were, very shaky about crimes through his second term when he was about to be impeached. Richard Nixon was not actually impeached or convicted because he resigned right before, but his approval didn't take a super significant dip. It dropped around, I think, 7-8 percentage points, but it was still surprisingly in the positive. I think the American public hadn't had time to fully go through everything that he had done, but President Trump leaves office with a high 30s in terms of approval. And that's something that is really going to haunt President Trump and a lot of his surrogates, because President Trump did not enjoy the lame duck bump that normal presidents do. When you take a look at his approval right after the election, I mean, he was approved of on November 3rd by 45% of the American people, just 53% disapproved of him. And this was actually one of his better showings throughout his entire presidency. We all know that as the election season gets closer, whether it's the midterm elections or the presidential election, that President Trump does alter his character slightly. I mean, he gets a lot less boisterous in his claims, and he gets a lot less I guess you could say, spontaneous in the way that he campaigns. And people do realize that. In 2016, his advisors, I remember watching this on CNN, President Trump had openly admitted that his advisors had told him to remain staying presidential because this is what would win him the presidency. And while he didn't win the presidency, he definitely got a lot closer than he would have had he been at an approval rating similar to the one that we see today. But normally what you would see after a president loses, since they technically have no significant power, is that the American people start to approve of them more. And for a short period of time, his approval actually went up in the immediate days following the election. Not by a lot, but it reached 45%, 0.2 higher than it was on election day. But after, a number of claims about the election being rigged, and then, that brought his approval rating down significantly. And then the failed Capitol insurrection, a terrorist attack, you'll call it what it is, his approval rating went from 42 down to 38. And his disapproval rating went from just 53 all the way up to 58. So it's gone down a little bit to 57.4%. 39% of Americans approve of President Trump on his final day in office. And this will likely be what is the reminder of President Trump, because everything that you remember about Richard Nixon, most of it is negative, right? Most of it is negative, despite him winning his re-election bid with every single state except for Massachusetts. I mean, he won 49 states. He didn't win D.C. He didn't win Massachusetts, but he won 49 states, every congressional district. Donald Trump didn't exactly have a landslide victory in his second term. He didn't even win a second term. He didn't have a landslide victory in his first term, though he does claim that it was a landslide victory. You see, he didn't have electoral college victories similar to Reagan or Nixon or really any other type of Republican president. The only one he really beats is George W. Bush. And when you're looking at his approval rating, it didn't start out too high either. A lot of these Republican presidents, even if they won by narrower amounts, George Bush, for instance, they still had higher approval ratings entering the first few months of their presidency. Donald Trump was not even approved of in February of 2017. From then on, the disapproval rating overtook the approval rating throughout the remainder of his entire presidency. And when something super negative happens at the end of someone's presidency, that is what you will remember them for. That is what the American people will likely remember of President Trump. They're not going to remember that statement that he made in 2017 about New Hampshire being a drug-infested den. They're not going to remember about the rallies that he held in 2018 during the midterm elections. They're not going to remember the claims he made about Elizabeth Warren, about Pete Buttigieg, about Kamala Harris, about Joe Biden in 2019 during the Democratic primary season. What they're likely to remember him for is the election failing to accept the results of a free and fair election. On top of that, they're likely going to remember the Capitol insurrection. This happened so closely to the end of his presidency that even his approval rating, it was surprising to see how much of a dip it really took, because he's on his way out. On top of that, not only does he have a very low approval rating, we'll get back to that in just a moment, we can actually see that the majority of the American people still support removing him from office. When these polls were taken, Donald Trump had less than 2 weeks left to go, and yet the majority of Americans still approved of removing him from office, not even impeaching him. Impeaching him was much higher. Removing him was still the majority. And I find it very interesting that just 0.7% of Americans voted for Joe Biden, and 52.5% support removing him. You can see where that comes from. 14% of Republicans support removing President Trump. That's interesting. But let's go ahead and take a look back at the approval, because I want to show you. I want to back up my claim that his disapproval rating is the highest we've seen amongst any outgoing president. Barack Obama, George W. Bush, when you're looking at the disapproval rating, even though Bush was a very unpopular president, well, this number is much higher. Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, even Jimmy Carter, right at the end, Donald Trump overtakes him on the final day of his presidency. He was below Carter for a very short period of time, higher than him in terms of disapproval for the majority of the presidency, but right at the end, on the final day of his presidency, he overtakes Jimmy Carter, which officially makes him the most disapproved of president leaving office in United States history. The most disapproved of president in United States history leaving office. Polling hasn't been around too often. I mean, they've always had it, but Harry S. Truman was the first one where we've had consistent polls taken about a president's approval rating. But President Trump now takes the cake. He takes the record as being the most disapproved of. Jimmy Carter's the only one who has had a lower approval rating leaving office. I mean, this is very strange to see. You will see right here, the only president to have a lower approval rating is Jimmy Carter. He is the only one. Donald Trump has a lower approval rating than Harry Truman did leaving office, than Eisenhower did, than Kennedy did, than Johnson did, than Nixon did, than Ford did, Carter did, Reagan did, Bush did, actually, sorry, not Carter, Clinton did, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. That's not good for President Trump. That is what will be the remaining few numbers of his entire presidency. He won the election in 2016. He flipped Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Florida. He retained North Carolina, what would be states that are competitive, Georgia, Arizona, Texas, states that were slightly more competitive in 2016 but still retained in the Donald Trump column. But then 2018 rolls around, and his very low approval rating really hurts the GOP in the midterm elections. It's not 2010 comparable, but it's definitely something that the GOP did not necessarily see coming. You see, they lost 40 seats in the United States House of Representatives. The Democrats won back control. And while the Democrats didn't win back control of the United States Senate, they definitely did a lot of damage control. Had you applied the 2016 election results, well, Republicans would have won in Montana. They would have won in Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia. That alone is enough to be 7 Senate seats. That would have put the Republicans at a 60-40 majority, had the numbers reflected the 2016 results. So arguably, the Democratic Party did do well in the midterm elections. They won in West Virginia. They won in Montana. They picked up Arizona. And in the states they lost, it wasn't by a lot. All of these were narrow margins, except for North Dakota, which was decided by just 10 points. And the Democrats were able to win in the Rust Belt by very large margins. Wisconsin was a larger margin than Missouri was for the Republicans, or Indiana was for the Republicans, or North Dakota was for the Republicans, or Tennessee, or Florida, or even this special election in Mississippi. Wisconsin was a larger margin than the special election in the Senate race in Mississippi. The Democrat in Mississippi got closer than the Republican in Wisconsin. So 2018 definitely was a Democratic wave. While the net gain numbers in the Senate may not necessarily reflect that, it certainly was in terms of where the Democrats were able to come close and where they were able to pick up states. And in 2020, this only solidified the GOP's worst fears in the United States Senate and on the presidential map. The Democrats won back the blue wall, and Donald Trump retained Ohio, retained Iowa, retained North Carolina and Florida, but lost Georgia. That was a big one. That was a very big loss for the GOP. They lost Arizona. They lost 2 Senate seats in Arizona as well. Not only did the Democrats win back the presidency, but they retained control of the House, and they won back the United States Senate. Not only does Donald Trump go out being the most disapproved of president in U.S. history, leaving office, on top of that, he is the first president since the 1930s to be the incumbent party in his re-election bid that loses the House, loses the Senate, and of course loses the presidency. The trifecta in government that we normally don't see too often. The trifecta. Donald Trump is the first president to experience this loss for his political party, not just Republicans, for any incumbent political party since the 1930s. Nearly 100 years. And Donald Trump is the first one. That will be the stain on his entire legacy. That will be what the American people remember him for. The GOP will remember him for losing both Arizona Senate seats. Martha McSally had a pretty big hand in that, but Donald Trump certainly did not encourage more Republicans to turn out to vote against the Democrats, at least more than the Democrats did. Turnout was definitely high, but it was not higher enough that the Republicans were able to win. In Georgia, both Senate seats went to the Democratic Party after Biden had won the election. That rarely ever happens, and the last time the Democrats did better in a runoff election in Georgia was in 1998. And that was with 2% voter turnout. I said that right, 2%. It was much higher in terms of turnout this time. There was 2016 presidential election turnout in terms of comparison, but the Democrats won Georgia at large, Georgia regular, and Georgia special. And this largely had to do with Donald Trump's impact on the races in this state. So the Democrats won control of the Senate. But the Republicans have had control of the House for 2 years and control of the Senate for 4 years, so Donald Trump was bound to get something done, right? Well, not necessarily. You see, the PolitiFact website has pretty much just covered all of the promises that President Trump agreed to hold. He's compromised on roughly 1/5 of them. He's kept roughly 1/4 of them. But he's broken 52% of promises that he said he was going to complete. Some notable ones: the wall. Another notable one, the Supreme Court. Sorry, not the Supreme Court, Hillary Clinton. The Supreme Court was one of the few things that Donald Trump actually did well. But that had to do with the fact that there were vacancies. That wasn't something that could have been, an automatic assumption that was going to happen. The economy isn't doing as well as he promised it would be. When we're talking about his major promises, all you heard him talk about in 2016, when we think about the 2016 election, the reason why he won in the Rust Belt, economy. Part of the reason why he won in Florida, immigration. Part of the reason why he did so well across the southern border, talking about the wall. But that just didn't happen. You see, we did have immigration reform, but DACA has now been reinstated. The wall certainly has not been built. Obamacare was not repealed or replaced. On top of that, Hillary Clinton is not in jail. The economy was a major playing point for President Trump. Well, the economy is at a worse point than it was entering into the 2016 election. And yes, that largely has to do with COVID-19, but you can't deny that President Trump could have taken precautions when he was on tape agreeing with people that COVID-19 was a much more serious threat than we actually realized, and then 2 months later, still telling the American people that it's not as big of a threat. I understand you do want to make sure that people don't panic, but this is a global pandemic, and we're in it almost now for an entire year. And had we taken precautions the same way other countries have, and I get it, they're smaller, but some of them are much more dense in terms of population. So COVID-19 should have spread much more easier when you're talking about South Korea, when you're talking about some of those European countries. They should have been able to contain it much worse than the American people could have. But because we had probably a 2-month delay as a result of President Trump not wanting to really make the public panic, or at least he says, that's something that really hurt him in his re-election bid, because handling COVID-19 was of the utmost importance in the minds of the American people. And had COVID-19 not been a thing, the economy likely would not have been in such a bad position. And I do think Donald Trump would have been had a much easier pathway to re-election had COVID-19 not been a part of the discourse for the 2020 election, which is largely why I think he downplayed it, because he knew, if anything, that would take down his re-election bid. And it did. President Trump also had a number of other things. You can find this on the PolitiFact website. They pretty much go through every single promise that President Trump has said that he was going to make. Every time you see one of those red bars as I'm scrolling, it means he abandoned this promise. Every time you see a green one, that means he went through with the promise. And every time you see a mix, it means he compromised. But you can see there's a lot more red than there is green on the PolitiFact website. There's a lot more red than there is green, which means President Trump leaves office with breaking 52% of his promises. Now, not to say every president keeps their promises. Every president breaks promises. But President Trump's low approval rating is directly correlated with these broken promises. But the things that he did do, well, he fundamentally reformed the GOP, for better or for worse. We have yet to see when he's not on the ballot. He reformed the GOP. He completely changed American politics, for better or for worse. We have yet to see how the American people will react to Trump-like candidates and a Trump-like party. On top of that, the Supreme Court, he filled 3 vacancies in the Supreme Court. That is unprecedented. Three vacancies is a lot. I mean, that's 1/3 of the entire Supreme Court that will likely be serving now for his nominees for 20, 30, 40 years, 50 years for some of them. They will be on that bench for a very long time. So right now what we see is that Donald Trump leaves office with a very low approval rating, has consistent election losses as the reminder, as the ending of his presidency. A loss in 2018, loss in special elections, loss in 2020, loss in runoff elections that held right after the 2020 election, losing the popular vote by 5 percentage points, losing the popular vote by 6 million votes, 7 million votes actually, 7 million votes, 5 percentage points, and still, Joe Biden defeats Donald Trump by, ironically, the same margin of victory that Donald Trump defeated Hillary Clinton. And he referred to the first victory as a landslide, which means some could argue that this was a landslide. I don't think either was a landslide, but either of them were a landslide. But I do think that if you're using his own words against him, well, you could say this one is a landslide. And many Democrats already have. So this is something that is definitely going to hurt President Trump. The shift in the entire country cannot be understated. The entirety of the map, the entire electoral map shifting to the left from Donald Trump, despite him claiming that he was going to win by larger margins, that there was going to be a red wave in the United States. Yes, Republicans picked up seats in the House, but they certainly did not pick up seats in the Senate. They certainly did not win more on the Electoral College than they did in the past. And when Donald Trump isn't on the ballot and the Republicans run Trump-like candidates, they lose. And we will see what happens in 2022. But if the Republicans can't tap into a base that only one person really can, and Donald Trump removes himself from politics or he forms a new political party, a video on that tomorrow, well, we would see something that could definitely hurt the GOP for decades to come because of one president who leaves office being the most disapproved of in United States history. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Watch the inauguration today. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my post 2020 election videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.